Hello everyone, welcome back for another bit of APUSH. So today we're going to be looking at the social causes of the American Revolution and how the revolution led into the Revolutionary War. I'm looking a little bit about how when we define the revolution, the definition of the American Revolution isn't always the same definition as the Revolutionary War. Even leaders back in that time sort of marked that difference, so keep a lookout for that. And let's look at what happened to cause this war. So, before, something that we looked at in the previous one was many of the causes relating to the French and Indian War, correct? So that had to do with the incursion of this major debt for the British government, and they started to create more taxes to help pay for that. So we're going to pick up right there. So last time I talked about the Stamp Act already. So it was that all-encompassing tax, and because it covered so many things, people opposed it because it affected their everyday lives. So generally, the pattern we see with this, taxation without representation, as you see in the descriptor on the left, had to do with this repeal and replace process, where the British would see the uproar and the conflict happening because of this tax, and they said, okay, they don't like this tax, let's repeal it, but then replace it with a different tax that might be a little bit less or on items that might not cause such an uproar. But this never really worked. So the Stamp Act was repealed, it was replaced. Some of the ones that went in series are the Townshend Acts, and then later on the Tea Act, and after that the Coercive, or also known as the Intolerable Acts. Okay, it's back and forth, repeal and replace, but this did not appease the colonies. And eventually what happens is, at first they didn't so much object to taxation in general, they objected to imperial taxation, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But as time went on, because of the constant repeal and replace process, it made them hate taxation in general instead of being okay with taxes as long as they made them. Okay, so let's look at kind of the data on these taxes. So strictly speaking, they weren't actually that high. One thing they did require was that the taxes be paid in sort of in kind. So that means in gold or silver, something with more intrinsic value, because the British did not trust colonial paper money. And a lot of the things that were taxed related to things dealing with the elite, so credentials, contracts, shipping, and merchants, all of which were the wealthier people in society, the same people who had the power to cause an uproar among the more lowly people that didn't have as much, that weren't as affected as much by the taxes. So yes, the taxes were one after another, but if you look at the numbers, they weren't as bad as often mythicized within our history. Okay, the rallying cry of the time was no taxation without representation. Now, what this was referring to is the colonists, they were British subjects, and they said Britain has this tradition of a sort of mixed government with the monarchy and parliament. And parliament has this democratic element where you elect your representatives. And they said, we have no representatives in parliament. Okay, we're being taxed without representatives being able to advocate for us. So there was a push for that, and actually some people in Parliament supported the colonist cry for this, saying, yes, they're right, we shouldn't be able to tax them without their consent. Ultimately, what Parliament decided, and the monarchy was on this side as well, is that the colonists had something called virtual representation. So, claiming that the government as a whole represented its colonies. Notice the similarities here to the system of mercantilism, where the government protected the colonies. In return, the colonies helped the economy of the country as a whole. They applied this economic concept to representation as well. Of course, the colonists didn't like that too much, and this issue is not immediately resolved. Okay? So I already told you the British government was split. Some of them said, yes, the colonists have reason to be angry. Others said they're being ridiculous, spoiled children, and we just need to ignore them and move forward. Now, the problem with that is it led to a muddled and ineffective response. So one of the reasons we kept on going repeal and replace, was because Parliament couldn't decide what to do. Were they going to use sort of soft power by negotiating things, or were they going to use sort of, hard power in terms of actually sending in the military and starting a war over this? And because there was no clear path forward, we eventually get to the Revolutionary War. Now, colonists were okay paying local taxes for local purposes. So if their colonial assemblies or the House of Burgesses or whatnot said, hey, we've created this tax, the colonists were saying, hey, we elected them to be our leaders. They decided this is the appropriate thing to do. We're okay with that, and we're happy to pay it out. The problem for the colonists was that Britain was making these taxes without their representation, without their consent, and to pay for things going on in the British Empire and not to pay for local services and local concerns. So that's the concern there. Next up, we're going to talk about some of the different groups that were involved in this budding revolution. So sort of one of the things that backed up this opposition to the British, now that the British were now imposing more power, had to do with previous things, especially with the Enlightenment, that many colonists thought they were entitled to. So they thought they had rights as British subjects. I've talked about these two things before, British common law and the English Bill of Rights. Colonists said that did not end at the borders of Great Britain. We deserve all the rights that people living in Great Britain do because we're British subjects. Other types of rights that they appealed to were rights of the individual. So I'm going to talk about it a bit later on as well, and we've already talked about it a little bit as well. But the Enlightenment brought about these ideas of natural rights. So the idea that because you are, a human being, you have rights. So like Locke said, life, liberty, and property. Especially the more educated are starting to understand these ideas and saying, well, I have rights as an individual, I have rights as a British subject, so Britain kind of forcibly changing things on us, that's not fair. So there were past traditions of self-rule. One of them had to do with taxation. So during salutary neglect, colonial assemblies made and collected the taxes for local use. And like I said, colonists were okay with that. Now, the shift with all these taxes, when we think about the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Townshend Acts, all these different ones that came about, those taxes were regulating trade. So even more telling the colonists what they could and could not do, and the revenue from these taxes was being spent in Britain to pay off the debt from the French and Indian War. Now, on the one hand, it seems pretty reasonable to say, well, you cost us this war, we paid for it, you need to help us pay it back. On the other hand, remember the colonists said, hey, we wanted to fight the war on our own, we don't want to pay taxes for something you did without our consent and without our approval. Okay, so this is it's kind of like conflict of ideas is causing a conflict, a real conflict, a tangible one in society at the time. Now, on top of taxation, another thing that used to be up to kind of self-rule and autonomy was the imperial administration. So, colonists used to choose their own judges, have their own courts, so basically they felt like their own people were deciding their fates when there was a trial by jury. Okay? Now, these new taxes and a change in the way the empire worked was making colonists feel like they didn't have that local control anymore. And one of the big things is that term in yellow, the vice admiralty courts. Now what this said is that if colonists were caught smuggling and violating these new taxes, they were no longer going to be tried by their own judges in their own colonial courts. They were going to be sent back to Britain to be tried in an imperial court where there was no local jury that would understand, and there was no locally elected judge that might favor the colonists over the British Empire. Okay? Obviously, colonists did not like that. They felt like this autonomy, these rights that they had, were being taken away. Now, another thing, royal governors were now chosen by the king instead of by colonial assemblies. If you remember before, during the Dominion of New England, they tried doing this, and it also received a lot of backlash from the colonists who were used to choosing their own leaders. Okay, so you can see in some ways Britain didn't quite learn its lessons from these past instances of trying to end salutary neglect, that they really had to abandon those attempts because they were never successful. Now that Britain has this huge debt, they feel this increased need to do it, but as colonial identity has developed, even stronger now is their sense of autonomy and how they really don't want Britain controlling them whatsoever. They just want to go back to salutary neglect. they would be fine if all the taxes went away, even if they could collect the taxes on their own and reestablish the old relationship. They don't like this new relationship that happened because of the results of the French and Indian War. All right, so the effort for American independence was energized by local leaders and by popular movements. So first we're going to look at some of the major leaders, those involved in kind of the groups they had, and then we're going to look at how the people themselves were more involved. Okay, major colonial leaders, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Dickinson, Benjamin Rush. The ones in red are important to know. The yellow ones are okay to know. What you need to know about them is they were all wealthy individuals who had political power in their states. So we've got some from Pennsylvania there, some from Virginia, some from Massachusetts. Those are some major powers within the colonies at the time. And so now that there's this opposition to British authority, there started to be an intercolonial approach. So people from different colonies getting together to try to solve their issues with Britain collectively. Okay, so one of them was the Committees of Correspondence, and this is kind of like the least, how do I say this? I always forget the term, it's okay. But it was the one that doesn't represent tons of opposition, but rather just having conversations and correspondence. So a lot of the colonies used to operate independently of each other. Now that they're seeing that they have similar problems with Britain, if they correspond and meet up, that's the chance to air their grievances, see where they align, and maybe create an approach to going to the imperial government and showing that these problems are not just in one, it's really with all of us, and we want to work together to solve them. Okay, so really just corresponding at first. Notice 1764, it's a year after the French and Indian War. It's even before the Stamp Act. So this was a very early form of colonial resistance, and it only gets larger as it goes on. Okay, fast forward to 10 years later, 1774, these committees of correspondence turn into a First Continental Congress. It means that each colony sent representatives to decide on things as a collective group. It's kind of like the next logical step of these committees of correspondence, going from just talking about it to actually making it happen. Okay. After this comes the Second Continental Congress with the Declaration of Independence. That's so important that it's a large part of a whole other presentation, so we're not talking about it this time. But realize when the Second Continental Congress meets, they create something called the Olive Branch Petition, where they were saying, okay, we're in this issue of open rebellion with Britain, and the colonists want to offer an olive branch, a sign of peace, saying, listen, all we want to do is go back to salutary neglect. We liked it when you left us alone. We like being British. We like being American. Let's just reestablish what we had, get rid of all these new laws that came about after the French and Indian War. So the king saw that, ripped it up, not literally, but metaphorically, and said, this means open rebellion, and that's one of the points at which the war really starts to get going. So you could say the revolution was kind of already happening in ideas and in opposing these taxes, and now the war begins after the Olive Branch Petition. Okay, let's look at some ways that the people were rallied together outside of the leaders' decisions. So colonial assemblies, such as the House of Burgesses, were used as an institution for rallying the people together. Now, the elite were in charge of these things, because, like with the House of Burgesses, you had to own land to be in it. But it was a forum in which people could give speeches and people could make points that could then be published, sent out to the people who could read, who would then formulate their ideas around the elite's ideas. So if you know the Patrick Henry speech, "Give me liberty or give me death," that's the idea of publishing this speech, because not many people actually heard it, and then people reading it, and then becoming angered and having similar views. Other organizations that were more from the people themselves, the Stamp Act Congress, which, as you could guess, was made to oppose the Stamp Act, and the Sons of Liberty was a group up in New England that was trying to band together to fight for their liberty as colonists and also to rally the people together. Now, all these ideas were spread through that existing print culture that I've mentioned before, where more people could read, there were more printing presses, paper was more readily available, so you could give a speech, but print it, and more people could get that same information that only the elite had heard before. So that's kind of the beneficial side to the people being involved, is there's more of a popular movement. On the other side, it can also sort of devolve into a mob mentality. So if you remember the French Revolution from AP Euro, you know that the mob mentality can be deadly and violent, and that did happen to some extent in the American Revolution as well. So the tax collectors that were in charge of, collecting all these taxes created by the British Empire, a lot of people wouldn't even take those jobs anymore. Some would resign their posts and just go back to Britain, because groups like the Sons of Liberty would find out who these people were, go to their houses, basically drag them out and tar and feather them. So pour, boiling tar on them, which would give them, severe burns, and then feather them to kind of, mock them. They'd even pour boiling tea down their throats to say, we don't like this tax on tea. They destroy property. So they were protesting, but it was not really in a beneficial way. Two good things that really represent that are the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party. Two things that basically resorted to violence, but sort of resonated with the working class, because it enabled them to see, this is our movement too. It's not just the elite. We can be involved through these organizations. So Boston Massacre and Boston Tea Party relate to those Lego scenes to the right. I found those online, and I love them. I don't know. So the Boston Massacre happened. Realized that New England was kind of like the hot spot for colonial opposition. So what happened is there was a larger military presence of the redcoats, and they were just posted. They would walk the streets at night. And what happened is, as they were guarding a building, some colonists started throwing snowballs and, screaming at them, verbal abuse. The British soldiers just stood their ground and didn't do anything. Now what happened is, colonists started throwing rocks. More people came, started throwing more rocks, and somewhere in there, a British soldier said he heard someone yell, "Fire!" So he shot on the crowd, then everyone started shooting on the crowd, and it became this, because of that kind of mob mentality, it became violent, okay? Now, the Boston Massacre, only a few people died, but that was the term used by the colonists to control the media message, okay? The Boston Tea Party was in protesting the tea tax in 1773. Now, with the tea tax, all the other taxes had been repealed, only the tea tax remained, and it actually made it cheaper for colonists to buy tea. But at this point, they were so angry about taxation that they threw a shipload of tea into Boston Harbor. They decided to dress up as Native Americans to kind of disguise their appearance. What happened as a result were those coercive acts I mentioned before. The colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. It closed Boston Harbor and heavily regulated things, and also brought in a greater military presence of redcoats as well. So that's where we see the revolution developing, even though the war hasn't started yet. Keep that in mind. Okay, so let's talk about wartime mobilization for the Revolutionary War. So the war begins we have it right here, in 1775 with shots at Lexington and Concord. So remember, New England was this hotbed for rebellion, and they started to form small militia. So they were called the Minutemen in various villages. Minutemen meant they were ready to stand up and go off to fight at any minute. Okay, so what happened is, some of these groups found out that the British were on their way to Lexington and Concord to seize an arsenal of colonial weapons. So what happened is, the Minutemen went out and stopped the British at that very bridge that you see on the picture there, and we don't really know exactly where the first shots were fired, but it's called the shot heard around the world, because it's this idea of it's the beginning of the American Revolution, a movement in itself that's very influential on other histories that happen later on. Okay, so the war has started essentially with this battle, and what happens is that Second Continental Congress forms to organize for the war. Now realize, they are not organizing for independence. That's not even, no one's talking about it yet. They're talking about going to war to reestablish salutary neglect. They appoint George Washington as head of the colonial army, so the war begins basically in the summer and the fall of 1775. We know the Declaration of Independence isn't until summer 1776. We'll talk about where that shift from reestablishing salutary neglect to wanting independence happens in a later lecture. So sides begin to form because there's a war at hand. Two different movements. There was the Patriot movement, which were those that supported the colonial leaders, and there was the Loyalist movement, those that supported the British leadership. Okay, so the Loyalists were okay with these new taxes. Oftentimes, the Loyalists themselves had some job involved in the imperial administration, so they would have lost out if we became the United States and became independent. Some statistics there. At the very beginning, so think around 1775, it's about 20% support each side, and 60% of Americans at the time were neutral. I like to think of it this way. Most people in America at the time were small farmers. They didn't have some vested interest in a revolution or in British control. So what they said to themselves was, okay, there's this movement going on. If we win, and if we win the war, I'm still going to be a farmer. If the British win, I'm still going to be a farmer. Okay, it didn't change what was going to go on with their economic livelihood or their lives, so they really just stayed out of it. Okay, and because there's low support of the Patriots at the time, that's why there isn't a big push for independence right away. All right, what were women's roles during the war? So remember, women are in this private sphere. They're expected to stay in the home and raise the children. But some women, especially those who had access to those with power, like Abigail Adams, her husband was John Adams, she was hoping that our budding revolution and maybe potential independence would bring about more rights for women. Okay, so if they're writing down how important these natural rights are, why not throw in a couple extra words and say women get it too? Okay, so she and her husband had a very lengthy personal correspondence, and they had a really different kind of relationship than many people at the time. He used her as an advisor on things going on in his political life as much as he might use other politicians. And she said in a letter to him that, remember the ladies. She said, you're working on this revolution, you're trying to bring about change, why not change life for us as well? Because not everyone has our type of relationship. She has this other line in the letter as well that says, all men would be tyrants if given the chance. Okay, so she says, remember the ladies, we're 50% of the population. So guess what? They didn't remember the ladies. We'll get to that at a later point. Now, because this war is going on, you have to fund the war somehow. So what happened is American currency suffers from high inflation. That means that suddenly the money that you had before can't buy as much as it used to. So suddenly your paper money seems pretty valueless. Okay, that was one of the reasons the British required payment in gold and silver in the first place. It's coming back to haunt the Americans now that they don't have British support for their own war efforts. So, as we get closer to independence, they start sending emissaries to foreign countries that might not support the British in order to ask for monetary aid. We get some from the Dutch after a lot of negotiations, and we're going to see later on just how important another power was, the French, in aiding us in the war. All right, this is our last slide, and it's a bit of a doozy because it deals with kind of the whole course of the war and the end of the war as well. So let's start. Now, the war really begins in the north, okay? Begins in the north because that's where the Patriot cause is located. The Patriot cause was mostly going on in, do you remember? New England. It was going on in New England. The South was, still having their slave system. They weren't really going to benefit from this revolution as much. And in the beginning, because the British military outnumbered the Patriots, that meant that it was more difficult for the Patriots to make any progress. Okay, remember, still, even during the war, you only had like 30-30. It was like a 1/3 split for those who supported the Patriots, supported the Loyalists, and then we're neutral. Okay, so we struggled with getting funding, we struggled with even fighting, and the British are very successful at first. Many British leaders said, oh, this will be over soon enough. But we eventually, the natives sided with the British too, so obviously we don't have their support, and of course they're going to support the British. The British are the ones that said, here's a line where the colonists can't go past it, and we said, we want to take the land. Now, a major turning point in the American Revolution was in 1777 with the Battle of Saratoga. It was our first major victory. George Washington was leading the military there, and we, at the time, we'd already declared our independence for about a year, we had emissaries like Benjamin Franklin in France trying to negotiate an alliance. And once the French saw that we could win a major battle against the British, they started to shift their mind and they said, oh, okay, we'll give you some funding. Eventually, the French are going to fund about 90% of our war. Okay, it's going to cause problems for them later down the line, but they helped us win. Okay, a low point for the Patriot cause was at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. It was the middle of winter. People were getting frostbite. They were running out of food and supplies because I don't think we had the French support there in a tangible way yet. But with that kind of low point was also some training for the American forces. Remember, most of the American forces were these Minutemen, these local militia that had they knew how to fire a musket in order to kill animals to hunt, but they weren't trained in sort of a very structured military strategy as the British were. The British were even recruiting professional mercenaries and soldiers to fight in their war. A Prussian officer came over and trained the American forces, and that helped them get better prepared to fight these formal battles against the British. All right, French alliance, I mentioned it before, it's the most important factor in American victory. Now, on the surface, it was kind of unlikely. France was a Catholic absolute monarchy, so you think they wouldn't favor a new republic, they wouldn't favor a country that was mostly Protestant, but France and Britain have been enemies forever, since the first 100 Years' War, since the second 100 Years' War. Go all the way back to, William the Conqueror's invasion of Britain. It's a long sort of, enmity, and it was existing up till here. So, what happens is Benjamin Franklin is there acting as a diplomat to secure support, and eventually, through the Battle of Saratoga and a lot of diplomacy, France promises that they will support us until Britain recognizes our independence. A major person who was influential in getting the French government to do that was the Marquis de Lafayette. So Marquis, that's not his first name, by the way, it's his title. A Marquis is like a lord of sorts. So what he did is he basically was lobbying within his aristocratic circle in the monarchy for French support. So he was kind of like our advocate within the French government. So he's eventually considered an American hero, and I think he's later awarded honorary citizenship in our country. Okay, he's involved in the French Revolution later on as well. All right, eventually the war does reach the South. As it does, Spain forms an alliance with us as well. They were hoping to get some better positioning in getting the British out of Florida and maybe getting some more land that used to be British if we won. But here was the thing. There wasn't a lot of Southern participation in the war. And part of that had to do with all these ideas of liberty and freedom. They said if this gets out too much, our slaves are going to hear it and they might want to rebel and join the war and push for their own freedom. And that would challenge the entire economic, political, social system that existed with African slavery in the Americas. So, didn't really work out. Now, here's what happened though, and it's a little bit ironic, is the British decided that they would split their forces and fight the war in the North and fight the war in the South. They thought there was a lot more loyalist support in the South than there really was. And so they said, we send down troops, we start these battles, and the colonists are going to flock out to join our ranks to help us. We'll defeat the South, and then we'll focus on the North. Well, guess what? That support didn't exist as much. It was mostly neutral in the South. So the British start to lose in the South, they're losing in the North, and all this converges at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. Now, the way I have remembered this since I was 10 years old in 5th grade comes from Schoolhouse Rock. Hopefully it helps you. The song goes, at Yorktown, the British could not retreat, bottled up by Washington and the French fleet. Cornwallis surrendered, and finally, we had won. Hooray! So essentially what happens is Yorktown is this city on a peninsula. What happened is Washington got his forces to block the peninsula and have a siege upon the British military there. The British figured, hey, well, we can just escape through the sea, but in came our French alliance, okay? The French sends in their navy that prevents Cornwallis, one of the main generals, from escaping anyway. He surrendered, And there were a couple smaller battles later on, but this is really kind of that death knell for the British Empire in America, because they weren't in a position to fight us anymore. Okay, so the war is over. The peace is not achieved until 1783, though. Okay, so it takes a couple years to negotiate what will be the outcome of this war. What did we get out of it? What did Britain get out of it? Britain recognized American independence. The U.S. got all land east of the Mississippi River. Britain's still up in Canada, by the way. Spain is still in Florida. By the way, Spain and France didn't get anything out of the treaty. So both of them thought, oh, good, the side we chose won, we're going to get something. Spain didn't gain any land. France didn't get back any of its money. In fact, we essentially said to them, sorry, we can't afford to pay you back that debt, but thanks for helping us out. And that's going to lead to the French Revolution. Britain was allowed to claim debts from the U.S., so we had to pay off debts to Britain, but not the debts to France, because they were our ally. All right. We're still going to talk a little bit more about the French or the American Revolution in the next successive slideshows, but this one was kind of focused on the causes of the war and the course of the war. We'll be looking at the ideological origins and the ideas behind it with the Enlightenment in much more detail in one of the next couple slideshows. All right, thanks for watching. Keep up on your work. I've said this enough that you should probably know what it is by now, and there it is. So have a good one, and I'm awkward. I'll see you soon.